Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 30th lecture in our course on drugs and behavior. Today we'll be talking about drug treatment and drug prevention. But first, this is the last lecture that will contain new material. As I mentioned last lecture, next week will be just for the final exam, so there will be a lecture, but it will be review, so nothing new, and sort of a way of wrapping up the course, putting it all together. As a side note, if you've not yet participated in the course evaluation, please do so. You should have gotten an email. Uh, if you didn't, it probably got put in your spam folder, so check that. But please do fill it out. The feedback, especially specific feedback, is always helpful. So please do so if you haven't already. Okay, so today we'll talk about drug treatment and drug prevention. Of course, those are obviously related topics. Not dealing with any particular drug this time, uh, but what we'll be looking at is different models of drug use. And of course, way back at the beginning of the course, we talked about this to some degree, about things like the moral model of drug use or withdrawal avoidance. Why do people use drugs, and why do they continue to do so? Why do they abuse drugs? Uh, and so this obviously has some bearing on how we approach drug use prevention and the treatment of drug use and drug abuse. Uh, so what methods do we use? Even if we have an understanding of what causes drug use, how do we address that? And then how effective are these methods? So that's one of the big important criteria, of course. If a method is right on in terms of assessing drug use and understanding drug use, but can't actually change it, well, maybe a new tactic is called for. In any event, specifically what we'll do is look at how society has understood what causes drug use. And of course, this has evolved throughout history, but certainly over the last 50 or 60 years when it comes to drug prevention in particular. So we'll look at different ways of preventing drug use, different ways of classifying anti-drug campaigns, different groups that can discourage people from using drugs and how they go about that. And we'll also look at drug treatment. And there are a variety of drug treatment programs, and how they work differs. They're the two big classifications are the sort of psychosocial therapeutic approaches, behavioral approaches, and then there are the pharmacotherapies, those that involve using another drug to combat abuse of the first drug. So we'll talk about both those today. Okay, so when it comes to drug prevention, one of the biggest questions we have to ask ourselves is, what are we trying to accomplish? So is it we're trying to eradicate all drug use, or are we just trying to mitigate or eliminate drug abuse? And of course, those are terms we've been using since the beginning of the course. Um, Almost everyone uses drugs at some point. They could be prescribed, they could be totally legal, but more or less everyone has used them, even if they're over the counter. Drug abuse, of course, is problematic. But the question is, are we looking to avoid drugs completely or just provide a way so that people can use them responsibly? So there are a variety of ways to try and prevent drug use. There's what's called primary prevention, which is and it's usually aimed at children and usually done through school campaigns. But this is a campaign that tries to prevent trying drugs at all. That's sort of the easiest way to prevent drug abuse is to encourage abstinence from drug use and to keep individuals from trying them in the first place. There's secondary prevention, which is aimed at individuals, broadly speaking, who have experience with drug use but aren't quite at the drug abuse stage yet. And secondary campaigns are intended to keep that drug use from expanding. That is, to keep the individual from trying other, possibly more dangerous drugs, and also to keep them from escalating their current patterns of drug use. So to keep someone who drinks alcohol, who's tried alcohol, from becoming a regular user of alcohol, for example. Then, of course, there's tertiary prevention, and these are campaigns that are directed at individuals who have already been abusing drugs, and this is to prevent relapse. So this is sort of a maintenance program. The person has been abusing drugs, they have stopped doing so, and now this is a campaign that keeps them from relapsing. You can also look at campaigns from the perspective of who's being targeted. What is the target audience? What demographic are we hoping for? So there's, of course, the most general is universal prevention. And so this is generally aimed more at adolescents, so you could say that's not really universal. There are very few campaigns aimed at adults over 70 years of age. But the idea here is that we're not honing in on any one particular population within children and adolescents. There's also selective prevention, and this is where certain individuals are identified as being at risk. So these are individuals who perhaps are not performing well in school or are lower socioeconomic status um, or already displayed other at-risk behaviors, certain criminal behaviors, for example. So these are not, again, not individuals that are abusing drugs, but are at risk for doing so eventually. And then finally, there's what's called indicated prevention, which is now there's actual signs that the person is abusing drugs, and now we can try and prevent that, or at least prevent it from becoming more severe. So we have these different types of prevention. Um, so we can classify these campaigns, but the bigger question is, what's causing drug abuse? If we can prevent the cause of drug abuse, then our job will be much easier and will be much more effective. Uh, so one of the first hypotheses was that drug use was caused by a lack of knowledge. That is, that people started using drugs and abusing drugs because they weren't aware of the consequences of drug use. This is what's often known as the knowledge, attitudes, behavior model that was promoted in the 1960s as a response to the rise in drug use and recreational drug use that was seen in the 1960s. The idea here is that if you change someone's knowledge, you emphasize the negative consequences of drug abuse, so they didn't know them before, that'll change their attitude toward drug use, and that'll consequently change their behavior. Interestingly, this didn't work quite the way that people anticipated. So it turns out that having these positive attitudes toward drug use, that is, being more likely to use drugs, was actually positively correlated with knowledge. That is to say, the more you knew about drugs, the more likely you were to actually have a positive attitude toward them, which is the exact opposite of the intent of this model. That being said, the knowledge of drug use increased, and the use of drugs as a consequence seems to have increased. But what it did is it also decreased escalation. So more people were using drugs or trying drugs, but fewer people were abusing them. So again, it gets to the question of what is our goal for drug prevention? Are we trying to prevent all drug use, in which case this was not very effective, or are we trying to prevent drug abuse, in which case this arguably was effective? The second model that came along, this is the 1970s, was the idea that the drug use is not caused by a lack of knowledge, that people are more or less aware of what drugs do and what their effects are, but that drug abuse in particular results from poor decision making. And so here the idea is that it's not cognitive awareness of drug use consequences. It's the affective processes that seem to drive drug use behavior. So it's not that I don't know that heroin is bad for me. It's that I use heroin for the affective experience, that there's an emotional process, or that I'm using heroin to avoid some sort of other emotional process. So getting away from the idea that it's purely information-based, that there's a decision-making process that involves emotion. So these campaigns, or this approach, was not particularly anti-drug. It's not to say it was pro-drug, it's just not specifically aimed at drug use in and of itself. It was aimed at decision-making. So there were things like role-playing exercises and asking children in particular to go through what's called values clarification, which is asking the participants to really think about and to say what it is they care about. What sort of experience are they looking for in life? What do they value? And so if you value excitement, you don't need to turn to stimulant drugs. There are alternatives to that. You can engage in exciting hobbies. Um, if you are looking to relax, if you have a stressful life, you don't need to turn to a depressant or abusing alcohol, for example, just to relax. There are other ways to relax. And so the idea was that if the person sort of reflected and figured out what they were really going for, what they wanted out of life, they could figure out some way other than drug use to achieve that. And this program also emphasized social skills, the idea being that being socially isolated tended to increase drug use. So integrating people socially was a way of combating drug abuse. So then along came the 1980s, and the 80s really saw a focus on the social component of drug use. And so this was one of the most famous was the Just Say No campaign. So there was an emphasis on refusal skills, the idea that peer pressure, that peers really drive the experimentation of drugs and the continued use of drugs. And so by developing those refusal skills, ways of saying no, um, that you could combat peer pressure. Also, the establishment of social norms, that is, as a community or as a school, making it clear that drug abuse is not acceptable. And that exerts a different kind of social influence. So you have these two sort of opposing forces, the social peer pressure to perhaps use drugs, depending on your peer group, but also the social pressure from the community at large not to use them. So this developed into what's often known as the social influence model. And again, there's an emphasis on refusal skills and being able to say no when drugs are offered. Um, it also uses techniques like public commitment. So getting the individual to stand up in front of a group and say that they're not going to be using drugs. Uh, that way they're on the record. And then these sorts of commitments in front of other individuals are effective for a variety of behaviors, not just drug use. But it was used in this program as well. Also looking at advertising. So certainly things like alcohol, cigarettes are advertised. And the idea here is to look at these advertising campaigns and see where the contradictions are. Does using these drugs really make me more glamorous? Does it make me more attractive? Does it make me cool? And demonstrating that no, not really. So maybe these ad campaigns aren't making the ad campaigns less alluring than they were at first. You also have things like normative education. So, and this is knowledge-based. Demonstrating that, in fact, no, not everyone at your school is smoking or drinking, indicating that these drug use behaviors are actually relatively rare. And it's not the case that everyone's doing it and you need to do it also to fit in. And you also have things like teen leaders for elementary and junior high school children. So the idea you have not just a peer, but someone sort of in your peer group that has higher status. So someone who's in high school coming in and saying that they don't use drugs. It's sort of a role model approach. It's another form of social influence. In terms of specific programs, one of the most famous is the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program, also known as DARE. And this started in Los Angeles, and the individuals that the school children would interact with were police officers. So these are representatives of the community, representatives of law enforcement. And so this was, again, a public program aimed at school-age children. And so here, it turns out that this was a good confidence builder, that there were good social outcomes from the program, but there was actually a limited effect on drug use. So moving on from there, there were more successful programs in the domain of drug use, like Project Alert. So this is a case where the target audience was junior high students, and these were health educators and teachers that have been trained by health educators, so a different population. So not a law enforcement perspective, but a health-based perspective. And this campaign was aimed primarily at alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana. It didn't really do much in terms of alcohol. It didn't decrease the incidence with which people would start smoking, but it did seem to help with the cessation of smoking. So fewer people were smoking after they'd started, so that more people quit under this program than the control group. Also, there was a decreased initiation of cannabis use. So fewer students in the program started using marijuana than those that weren't in the program. So some successes there, not, didn't succeed in every domain, but succeeded in some. And of course, there are non-school programs as well. And these are things like peer programs. These are sort of like group therapy sessions in most cases, where you get a group of peers. And this, again, helps establish these social norms. The idea that when you're in a peer group, if you're talking to other peers, you learn that no, not everyone's using drugs. You also get support, and it's also a form of public commitment. Of course, you have family programs, particularly parent education, parent support groups for parents of children that are abusing drugs. And you have things like community programs. And again, this really enforces those social norms, the idea that in this community, drug abuse is not acceptable. And of course, that's a visible signal the community can present. And you also have workplace programs, and these are more sort of enforcement-based, things like drug screening and drug testing. And of course, many workplaces will also provide access to drug treatment programs if that becomes an issue. Speaking of which, we'll now move from drug prevention to the flip side of that coin, drug treatment. So drug prevention obviously meant to prevent drug abuse, but what happens if drug abuse is already ongoing? Well, now we need a way of stopping it. So that's where we get into drug treatment. And again, we have this issue of what are our goals with drug treatment? Are we trying to induce total abstinence from the drug, or simply responsible controlled use? And of course, this is something that occurs particularly with alcohol. There are programs that say the only way to stop alcoholism is total abstinence from alcohol for the rest of your life. And some programs say, well, alcohol on occasion is okay, especially in moderation. So there's a spectrum of beliefs on this issue. What is our goal with drug treatment? And of course, there are two big types of treatment programs. One is the behavioral or psychosocial treatments. So this involves social, so a group of peers that are usually have drug abuse in common, or other forms of therapy, but they're behavior-based. So they're cognitive. They're getting the individual to learn and to exhibit a different behavior. The other approach is pharmacotherapies. And this is where a drug is administered to assist with drug treatment. And of course, these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. You can use these in combination with one another. But those are two big groups, so we'll talk about one and then the other. There are, of course, differences between these programs. Some programs emphasize avoiding negative consequences. So stopping drugs in order to avoid those negative consequences that drugs have had in your life, or drug treatment programs that look to alleviate withdrawal symptoms for those users that are staying on drugs in order to avoid withdrawal. You also have treatment programs, and these are mainly pharmacotherapeutic, that look to remove a drug's rewarding properties. So if the drug is no longer rewarding, no longer reinforcing, the idea is that the user will stem or even stop their drug use. And finally, another way of employing a drug treatment program, of designing one, is to use alternative rewards. So not keep the drug itself from being rewarding, but offer an alternative that's as rewarding or more rewarding. So we'll start with the behavioral and psychosocial treatments. The most famous, of course, is Alcoholics Anonymous, which was founded in the 1930s. And this introduced us to the disease model of alcoholism. And we talked about this in our section on alcohol. The idea that alcohol is a disease in some ways, not in others, but in AA it is described as a disease, but as one that can be cured. The emphasis for AA, of course, is total abstinence. So this is that end of the spectrum. That once you are an alcoholic, that you can never, if you wish to be successful, you can never drink alcohol again. And AA's focus is on the person who has what they call hit bottom, which is to say they've started to suffer the extreme negative consequences of their alcohol abuse, and now they are prepared to seek treatment to stop their abuse now that they've really witnessed and then really felt those effects, those negative consequences. Of course, AA does get some criticism for having religious content, so obviously that's fine in and of itself. There's some controversy over whether courts should be allowed to mandate somebody go into Alcoholics Anonymous for alcohol abuse because it has religious content. Well, one of the several of the tenets of the program are that you surrender to a higher power or you defer to a higher power in some way. And of course, for those that whose religious tenets don't align with that conception or that aren't religious at all, that's a potential problem. So it's not for everyone, but it has been shown to have some effectiveness. There's also motivational enhancement therapy. And what that does is look at the stage that a person is in with respect to their alcohol abuse, or not just alcohol, any drugs. So it divides drug abuse into a variety of stages, and we're not going to go into detail on those now. But there's pre-contemplation, for example, which is the person has not acknowledged their own drug abuse yet. Eventually, they come to acknowledge it. They form a plan of action to get themselves off of the drug. They enact it, and then they have to maintain it. So this is actually more of an assessment technique than therapy. Just going through this process isn't very effective for addressing drug abuse itself, but it does allow the individual or individuals' caretakers to assess where that individual is with regard to their drug abuse. You also have something like contingency management. And this is basically the offering of material rewards in response to abstinence from drugs. The idea that if you are a drug abuser, if you test negative, that is, if you don't have any of the drug in your system, you get some monetary reward. You get a few bucks. And the longer you stay off of the drug, that is, the longer you keep passing those tests, then you get more and more monetary reward. And this has actually been shown to be pretty effective. For example, users of crack cocaine, if offered a few dollars, will often revert to their abuse of cocaine, but offer them enough money and they'll stay off it. Now, of course, this raises issues as well, because this is an expensive form of therapy, and you are effectively paying drug users not to use drugs. And the opponents of this program feel that's unfair. That's not a fair use of resources to be paying people not to use drugs. It's an open question. Finally, you have things like cognitive behavioral therapy, and this requires a fair amount of self-insight. So coming to understand what your triggers are, so to speak. So what induces cravings for drugs, what environments, what people, and learning to avoid those environments, learning to anticipate those drug cravings. This has been criticized for requiring too much on the cognitive end for the user, requires too much self-insight, but actually that doesn't seem to be the case. But this has actually been shown to be effective as well. Okay, so those are behavioral therapies, so there are no drugs other than drug of abuse involved in those. But there are, of course, pharmacotherapies. And again, these aren't mutually exclusive. Both of these approaches can be used, but for our discussion, I'll separate them like this. You have pharmacotherapies in which a new drug is applied as a way of treating abuse of the previous drug. And this is done for two big reasons. The first is to diminish withdrawal symptoms. So if it is with the negative consequences, that is the withdrawal symptoms, that is deterring someone from quitting drug abuse, then pharmacotherapy can be used to soften those withdrawal symptoms and make it so the user can get off the drug. They can also be used to block reinforcement in one way or another. So keep the drug, the drug of abuse, from being pleasurable, from being reinforcing. And so the idea, once the drug is no longer reinforcing, the individual will no longer be interested in taking it. And this on the right is a table from your book showing a number of pharmacotherapies, and these cover these two different domains. So in the domain of diminishing withdrawal, the idea here is that now, with this new drug, you can really control the dosage. Of course, people who abuse drugs are typically not very careful with the amount they're using at any one time, and of course they also build up a tolerance, so they have to keep on using more and more. With this pharmacotherapeutic approach, you can now control the dosage, so it's safer in that respect. And you're also typically using a drug similar to the drug of abuse, and typically it is one with fewer harmful side effects. So methadone in the case of opioid abuse, um, or benzodiazepines in the case of alcohol abuse, as we'll see in a minute. But again, the idea here is that by administering a similar drug, you can diminish some of that withdrawal without actually using the drug of abuse itself. Then there are maintenance therapies. So once the person has already gone through withdrawal, how do you keep them off of the drug of abuse? One is with what's called agonist or substitution therapy, and this is an idea similar to using a similar drug during withdrawal symptoms to alleviate the symptoms. The idea here is to use a similar drug to the drug of abuse, and that way the person will not have a craving for the drug of abuse. And again, we have methadone, for example, which the person has to keep on taking. And of course, this is a controversial issue. The methadone acts very similarly to heroin, for example, but it's not as dangerous as heroin. So is that a better approach? Is it better to be on methadone than heroin? In terms of health, yes. Is it a good long-term solution? Well, that's controversial. But again, the idea here is that with agonist or substitution therapy, you're substituting a similar drug for the drug of abuse. With antagonist therapy, you're getting to that, you're using the idea of blocking reinforcement. So by using, for example, naltrexone for alcohol or for opioids, you now are blocking the pleasurable effects, the reinforcing effects of the drug. And that leaves the person with very little motivation to keep using the drug if they can't feel the effects of it. There's also punishment therapy, less common, but this is most famous with alcohol, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But punishment therapy is the idea that you attach negative consequences to drug abuse, and so that, again, makes it less appealing, not because you're removing the reinforcing effects, but because you're adding other negative consequences. So more specifically, we'll look at a few drugs, some of the most popular ones. So for alcohol abuse, withdrawal from alcohol, as we've already discussed, is dangerous. It's actually potentially fatal. Unlike opioids, where it's like having the flu for a few days, if you're a severe enough abuser of alcohol and just quit cold turkey, that can kill you. So benzodiazepines are typically used in this case. And so these are drugs that we've already talked about in our unit on depressants. Alcohol and benzodiazepines are both depressants. Benzodiazepines are less dangerous in this case because, again, the dosage is controlled. They also last longer, so you don't have to keep on abusing alcohol. You can have longer lasting benzodiazepines in a controlled dosage. You can also use a form of punishment therapy, which is disulfiram, or marketed as antabuse. And this is a drug that interferes with the metabolic pathways that process alcohol. And so you end up building up basically toxins in your system, and it makes you nauseous and eventually sick. Of course, there's nothing pleasant about that. And it happens very quickly after alcohol ingestion. So it gives a very negative reinforcer for using alcohol. So that's a form of punishment therapy. For nicotine, for smoking, the most famous, of course, is the nicotine patch. And there, of course, you're taking smaller doses of the drug of abuse. But you're not smoking, so you're not taking in all those other toxins. But the nicotine patch, again, is a controlled dosage of nicotine that's administered over a longer period of time. More recently, you have drugs like bupropion, which is marketed as Zyban. Originally, it was used as an antidepressant called Wellbutrin, still is, but it was found that Zyban could be used to quit smoking, that those that were on this antidepressant were more successful at quitting smoking than those who were not. And this acts at a variety of neurotransmitter systems, norepinephrine, dopamine, but also acetylcholine, where nicotine primarily acts. Uh, but this is a different kind of approach. It's not a nicotine imitator. It is effectively a substitute at those neurotransmitter systems. So it's not really imitating nicotine, it's imitating the effects of nicotine again, in a controlled dosage. Moving on to the opioids, so you have methadone, which we talked about some. This is itself an opioid. Methadone lasts longer. It doesn't have the euphoria that some of the opioids can produce in sufficient quantities for regular users. But the downside is that effectively you're switching out one addiction for another. The person has to keep on taking methadone. It's not that you can't ever quit taking it, um, but it is still an opioid. It's just not as dangerous as the opioid that's being switched that you're switching in methadone for. Of course, you also have naltrexone, which is a different tactic. So methadone is a substitution pharmacotherapy. Naltrexone is an antagonist therapy. Um, so it blocks opioid receptors. So the opioid of abuse, the user no longer experiences the effects. Of course, that requires them to keep taking naltrexone. So this really only works for individuals that are really dedicated to the idea of getting off of opioids. Otherwise, to get back on them, all they have to do is stop taking the naltrexone, and then the opioids are effective again. Okay, so those are examples of specific programs. Now, looking at drug treatment overall, we can look at who's admitted to drug treatment programs, what they're being admitted for, and take some basic demographic information. And so we can look at what drugs are popular. And of course, this is filtered through going through drug treatment. More on this in a second. We can also look at what age range, what socioeconomic status, what sort of person is abusing drugs, but again, filtered through those that are actually seeking treatment. And we can look at the rates of use and compare that to the rates of individuals coming in for drug treatment. So alcohol is the most popular drug in the US, and so not surprisingly, it accounts for a large portion of drug treatment programs. Cocaine actually isn't as popular, and yet according to this table that we have here from your book, it accounts for 8% of drug treatment admissions, but it doesn't account for 8% of drug use. So that tells us something about perhaps the negative consequences that abuse of a particular drug yields. It tells us something about perhaps about that community of drug users and attitudes towards seeking drug treatment. And so we can get a lot of useful information just from admission data on drug treatment programs. The take-home point here is that drug treatment programs are actually pretty effective. They're not 100% effective, but they do have a decent success rate. There's always the risk of relapse, which is why it's so important to maintain those behaviors in which one abstains from drugs or at least controls their drug use. It's not the idea that you can go into a drug treatment program, complete the program, and then you're cured forever and never have to worry about it again. As we've already seen for so many weeks now, drugs alter how the brain functions, they alter behavior, and so those aren't always short-term changes. A lot of those are long-term changes, and that's an issue the person's going to have to deal with for the rest of their life. And so, again, it's important to have for the individual to concentrate on maintenance, and also for those around them to concentrate on maintenance. And of course, drug treatment also has an impact on society, economically and socially. So, is it worth someone going through drug treatment? Well, for the individual, it is. It may even end up saving their life. But for the society as well, if someone can be treated for drug abuse, they can become a productive member of society again if they weren't before. It's possible to be both a drug abuser and a productive member of society, but for those that are abusing drugs to the extent they can't contribute, now you have a person who can contribute to society again. So is that worth it? Economically, the data suggests that it is. This will actually be your discussion question for this week. Um, and so that is the open question, is whether it is obligatory for society to promote drug treatment programs. And of course, certain programs have ethical ramifications. So we've already talked about Alcoholics Anonymous and whether government institutions can put individuals into programs that have religious content. We talked about methadone. So how ethical is it to swap out someone's addiction to heroin for constant use of methadone? It's safer, at least the data suggests that it is. But is it ethical? The person is still addicted to a drug, effectively. So is that really solving the problem? So for all of these treatments have pros and cons, both in terms of effectiveness, what drugs they're designed to address, and these ethical considerations. Okay, so that will wrap it up for drug prevention and treatment. Next time, of course, it will not be new content. We will review for the final exam. So we'll wrap up the course, look at sort of the big picture. What have we learned over this course? And we will talk about the final exam. I've already sent out an email in terms of what to expect on the final, and the final will be almost exactly like the midterm exam in terms of formatting. It's not comprehensive, so the final exam will cover everything that wasn't covered in the midterm, but the format will be almost exactly the same. And that will do it. So I will see you next week, and be on the lookout for the posting on the final.